So now we have done so far the biological basis of behavior. The last two lectures that we had talked about the biological evolution and the concepts given for evolution of animals. Between that group belongs the Homo sapien. So evolution of all animal kingdom, and then evolution of the mammalians, and then the evolution of the Homo sapien as we understand. I hope that you have been following it and reading it through various encyclopedias, internet, and entertaining Discovery Channel and the National Geographic, if you have options of that. Because you'll see how similar we are when we, the Homo sapiens, talk about behavior. You'll see the same kind of behaviors in the animals on the lower phylogenetic scale. We talked about how Linnaeus gave the concept of the fixity of the species. Then we had Lysenko, we had Buffon. Everybody gave a few ideas which eventually Darwin built upon after his observations on the Galapagos Islands. And his observations, putting together previous theories and points of view, brought us the theory of evolution. The theory of evolution, the basic concepts, most important, natural selection, that nature selects, and the pressures of the nature select. We also have the concept of survival of the fittest, not the strongest, not the biggest, not the largest, but the fittest, which means fit genes, genetic-wise, the genes that can survive, propagate further. Then the concept of speciation, evolutionary adaptation, and so on and so forth. And you saw how one species can then adapt and become many species if it is in isolation. And we gave the examples of the finches in Galapagos Islands and the marsupials in Australia. We talked about how the mammalians became extremely efficient in surviving in the reptilian age. The dinosaurs, big, huge, humongous, could not survive. So the mammalian then developed into further species, and we had mammalians on land, mammalians on sea, mammalians on the mountains, in snow, in deserts, you name it, and the mammalian species has done extremely well. Then the advantage is that this evolutionary advantage of the mammalian species, one of the most important ones which I told you was of the mother being attached to the young and vice versa, till such time that the young has gained the knowledge enough and the body enough and the development enough to forage on its own. So there was protection of the young. And then I also moved into human evolution, and I gave you the first known, there are many, but at least 7 different developments and discoveries of the man-ape and the ape-man. The Australopithecus, the Java man, the begging man, Olduvai, Pithecanthropus, the Neanderthal, the Cro-Magnon, and so on and so forth. And I have some very interesting pictures to show you we talked about the tool use, and we talked about the thumb being so important in tool use. And bipedalism, walking, at the same time using tools, became intertwined. So both these developments really helped the man-ape develop and evolve into what we are now. One of the best pictures that I could see is a tool that I told you that man-ape had started developing tools. Now this is a tool from the Homo erectus, and the Homo erectus used this tool for cutting, and there is a sharp edge. This stone has been shaped. Now this was perhaps not found in the same way that we have found it, this was shaped by cutting the edges. And these edges then give the advantage of cutting meat or cutting the skin or scraping, and certainly very important how this has helped. Instead of just using hands, how the extension of the hands really helped. Then there is another picture that I would like you to see. I talked about the development of the brain, and the development of the brain then eventually gave rise to artistic capabilities. And in the caves, we have found drawings of animals that these man-apes were hunting. So they drew these, we knew how to make color. This is a bison or an antelope, and you can see that this picture is beautifully done for that brain and for that age and for that era. This is a picture taken from the caves in which the man-ape lived. I would like to show you another picture, and that is just to illustrate how the brain has grown. If you look at this picture, you see the brain of the fish, the brain of the rat, the brain of the cat, which we can't see unless we do this, the brain of the cat. And on the top, you see the two primates. One, which is the chimpanzees, and this is the Homo sapien. Do you see the difference? I would like you to note very carefully that it is the cerebral cortex which has grown. See, the cerebral cortex has grown, the yellow part. And earlier, the lower parts was as big as the cerebral cortex. But now, the higher brain, the growth of the brain and the evolvement of the higher brain has changed, has transformed this primate into this primate. And therefore, the controls of the behavior are also with the higher brain. Now, let's go back to what we were talking, but keep this picture in mind whenever you talk about the Homo sapien and how the Homo sapien species has evolved. Keep this picture in mind. That will really help understand where we are and why we are where we are. Now we move on to the next lecture. We had talked about the skull and the brain size, and I've shown you why the skull and the brain size was different. And I've also shown you that the cortex has increased. The cortex is the topmost part of the brain. The cerebral cortex has increased. And in the lower animal, the cortex that you see is only primarily means major part of the function of the cortex. The yellow part that you saw is of sensations, receiving sensory information, touch, visual, hearing, pain, all kinds of sensory motor information, taste, smell, and so on and so forth. But in man, this has evolved to a point where this is no longer sensory motor only. This has taken over, and it is what we call the association cortex. Association cortex is where all the memories are stored, and this is the mastermind now. Unless the cortex orders or puts together information, we really don't see, we really don't hear, we really don't think, we really don't have judgment, we really don't have foresight. So in the Homo sapien, the cortex has grown and has evolved. In fact, it has taken over. I also talked about the thumb. And if you look very closely, you can see the thumb. And have you tried this experiment? I asked you to do this in the last class. Use only 4 fingers and try to pick up a pencil or a pen or anything. And you'll see this is not possible. Only when you use the lever given by the thumb, you will be able to do that. So, the development of the thumb separation from the finger, that is the tool used. Anything that I need to grasp powerfully, this is the tool use that I have developed. And the Homo sapien got this advantage as well. So, the skull, the brain, the hands, the pelvic, the structure of standing up, bipedalism, stereoscopic vision, you can see far. So all this is certainly an advantage for the Homo sapien. Then in addition to this, we also see the development of evolvement of language. Perhaps there was this one ape man who could grunt in a different way, and he could change the grunts, and that survived. So intonations and making grunts louder and softer. And those grunts, these sounds that emerge from the throat, perhaps became the basis of language. Language perhaps only evolved around 20,000 years ago. The first formal language that communication has been used. Now the benefit of language, you don't have to be visible. In the dark, you could call and you could escape the predator. Or you can talk and give your signals through those communications. So, language being beneficial, and it evolved to a point where communication was possible using this symbol and this intonations and this form of modulating your sounds. At the same time that the language was being developed, foresight, language, the brain is now, go inside the brain, and you'll see the brain itself is now growing. And this evolution is taking place within the brain. And within the brain, the language is now evolving. And along with the language, the capability of foresight, thinking ahead. How do I move to hunt and plan? How do I survive the cave? How to keep warm? Using furs, fire. So all this came together. This is the foresight which came along with the language. I have shown you art and culture of the caveman. That is also part of the development of the brain and development of the language. Now there is one more development, which among others, but which is very noticeable. If you look at the picture of baboons and the chimpanzees and the Homo sapien, look at yourself in the mirror. You see, and the dogs, of course, we all have these canines. The canines which are used for piercing meat. The baboons have, the male baboon has the very long, sharp canines. And these canines grasp and tear the enemy. Very fierce, very fearsome, and very one of the sharpest tools that you have. Same in the lion. But think, along with the tool use, with the stone which could cut, this Homo sapien, this hominid did not need the sharp canines. Now with the sharp canines came the change in the jaw position. And the jaw which was made to support, and the neck which was made to support the force that the canine needed to pull meat is no longer needed. So the neck muscles became straighter, the jaw became lower, and the canines became smaller, like you and I have now. Very interesting. So, we did not need to fight using our canines. You see dogs fight, and they use their canine, they bear their canines. So, the fear is called through and conveyed through these canines. So, we no longer need to attack, hold, shake, pierce using our canines. And interestingly, the female baboon, the female primate, did not have large canines. Why? Because the female baboon or the female early primate did not need to hunt. It was the male who was the hunter. So, with a reduced canine size, the jaw shape changed. With the reduction of the jaw and the elaboration of the skull, the shape of the neck and the muscles of the neck also changed. Then, another evolution. which is very important, along with, and this is, I've been talking about this earlier, from earlier. It started with the mammalian evolution, where the female is now burdened with the caretaking of the infant. And this female, as we are part of the mammalian species, is also burdened with the caretaking of the young. So, the female role and the male roles are defined by biological evolution. In the same manner, the family evolved because now there is one baby that the father and the mother have to look after. The father has to look after the mother and the child, the ape man. So the ape man goes hunting. Now, why do you think ape man goes hunting? Very interesting. Sociobiologists say that he has his genes infested in this young baby. So he is hunting to provide to the provider, which is the mother, and to provide to the young, which is the investment. समझ लिया कि जीन का एक थैला है या जीन का एक पूल है जिसको वो फीड करेगा ताकि उसके जीन्स आगे चलें. Very purely biological sense. So therefore, the sexual dimorphism of roles came here within this evolution process. Keeping the family together for protection. And not just the family together, but here you also see the evolution of the social systems. The social groups evolved. The hunting males hunted together. And the females who were nursing stayed together. And therefore, you see in the early pictures of the caveman, you see in the cave several males, females, and young ones. So their origins of the family and origins of the society are same. So the villages, the concept of villages then emerged from that. How interesting that we did not think about it, but this is what it is. And when the village, concept of village or living together emerged, then the concept of food sharing. So hunting together, if it's a bison or a big elephant, and if 4 men go out to hunt the ape man, the man ape, 4 of them can hunt better together than 1 of them. So beneficial to work together. So food sharing, increased social contact, increased dependence, increased use of language, and along with that, if you remember, I showed you a picture of the ape. What you see is reduced body structure in the sense that we have less fat on the body. Reduced fat content because it's no longer needed. Reduced body hair, no longer needed because fire is there to keep you warm. And so is the fur from other animals. And so is the cave which is going to shelter you. So for thermoregulation, we did not need the additional hair that you see on the apes. Further, sweat glands were developed. They were evolved. And these sweat glands over the skin evolved because that gave the rapid diffusion of heat from inside the body to outside. And that is also a part of the evolution, albeit an important one, but not as obvious as other changes that we see. The next important one is, I have already talked about it, the stereoscopic vision or the binocular vision or the depth perception or the seeing over distances. Now this is extremely important because you could locate food without having to sniff it or hear it. So vision and the stereoscopic vision, depth vision became important. Along with that became important the perception, giving meaning to what you have seen. Now giving meaning to what you have seen implies that there is going to be memory. Because how can you give meaning to what you have seen unless you remember what it was like. So, memory became important, and this memory is so important that you could remember, the ape man could remember the food sources where there was a nut tree, or could remember where there was a water hole, and could also remember where there was danger. So, very important that along with the development of the vision, you have perception, you have memory, and memory then feeds both vision, perception, and other sensory systems. If we look at the biological table of evolution, and it is spread over trillions of years, man's evolution is perhaps a very, very minuscule part of it, very small part of it. बहुत छोटा पीरियड है पूरी एवोल्यूशन की हिस्ट्री में, लेकिन इंपॉर्टेंट है. दूसरी बात याद रखने की है कि ये एवोल्यूशन स्लो हो गया है. इट हैज स्लो डाउन. पहले भी स्लो था, लेकिन अब बहुत स्लो हो गया है. यू डोंट सी the rapid changes that perhaps happened because the natural selection pressures are lesser. Evolution, however, has become increasingly complex. Where are we headed? कभी आपने सोचा है कि जैसे आपको मैंने शुरू में कहा था कि अब हम चलना बंद कर दें और चलना कम कर दें, टांगों का इस्तेमाल कम कर दें, तो फिर एट्रोफी फ्रॉम डिसयूज, याद एक कॉन्सेप्ट आया था कि आप जब इस्तेमाल नहीं करेंगे तो बायोलॉजिकल एवोल्यूशनरी कॉन्सेप्ट्स, दिस पार्ट दैट यू आर नॉट यूजिंग शुड डिसअपीयर. मे बी a million years from now we'll see shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter legs till we such at time perhaps we don't need those legs. But think about it. It's a good question to think and to discuss among yourselves. So speculate, where are we going? Speculate, where are we heading? Then there are within this theory of evolution the concepts of evolutionary psychology, monogamy, family 1-to-1, one husband, one wife, one child, and so on and so forth, or polyandry, polygamy, and gender roles. All these are explained to some extent. I have tried it, and I have tried to explain it in the perspective of evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology. But there are discussions and discourses going on forever. People don't believe. Some people don't have this point of view. They say, no, roles are taught socially. But if you look at the biological perspective, it seems there is some evidence to state that these roles are there in the biological systems for the benefit of the species, and which is why they are evolved and which is why they have stayed within the system. Now that we have talked about the evolution of man, Homo sapien, let's talk about what makes the Homo sapien the superior or the animal on the highest phylogenetic evolutionary point of view. It is the brain, among other things, but I believe, since you and I are brain scientists, we believe it is the brain. Let's look at the evolution of the brain. First of all, the brain size has grown. If you remember, Australopithecus has a brain of 500 cc, and the Neanderthal around that time had a brain of 400 cc, and we have also a brain of 400 cc. Now, from 500 cc to 1400 cc, you do have a huge growth of the brain. And this huge growth of the brain, if you look inside the skull, it is the cerebral cortex. And remember the yellow picture that I showed you? That is the brain, the cortex which has grown. But, as I said earlier, it is not the size alone which is important. The elephant has a bigger brain. The whale has a bigger brain, where the man's brain is about 1300 to 1400 cc. The elephant has a brain of 8000 cc, cubic centimeters, large brain. And the whale has brain of 5000 cubic centimeters. So they have larger brain. But what makes a difference? That our brain, even though it is smaller, gives us the superiority. That is the intellectual functioning and the capacity of the cerebral cortex. The capacity of the cerebral cortex, amazingly, has evolved to this point that even to date, with all the machinery and all the technology that we have not been able to understand most of the functions. It's very complex. The second thing you must remember, that all humans have the same kind of brain except for those who have damage or a deficit of some kind. The geniuses have brains which are the same as you and I. The cerebral cortex of the geniuses, world famous geniuses, you name any, they have the same brain size and the same brain capacity and the same perhaps number of neurons approximately all over the brain as you and I have. But what is most important is that we have a cerebral cortex which does much more than the cerebral cortex of lower animals. The cerebral cortex has grown in size. Remember again the picture I showed you? It has convolutions, and I talked about these convolutions. These are the folds, and you can see these folds within the cerebral cortex. Very interesting. There are deeper grooves. So there are some places in the brain where the folds are deeper, like this hand. And there are some places where the folds are lesser, like these two fingers. But this is how the brain, the huge cerebral cortex, over 20 square feet, if you lay it in a straight line, it's been folded into this skull case. Very interesting. And I also earlier told you that the cerebral cortex has taken over. This has become the mastermind, the master control, the master computer, which runs the body and which runs the brain and which runs other functions. So we are programmed by our cerebral cortex to do things, and it modulates and it changes behaviors. So remembering all this, you ask me the question. I'm sure you asked me this question. Or you ask yourself the question, what has evolution got to do with psychology? I'm doing courses in psychology. I do not understand the relationship of evolution with psychology, with how are we going to relate it? So, I relate it. First of all, it provides insight into the complex behaviors of man. It's not easy to understand because behavior, there are many facets of behavior. And you, as a student of psychology, have already studied some. Social behavior, behavior of the child, developmental behavior. And then we have the behavior of families. So there are so many behaviors. Why do I feel the way I feel? Why do I act the way I act? So, in order to understand human behaviors in all its dimensions and how these behaviors evolve in all these dimensions, we go and study the basic, which is the biological system. And basic, the brain evolution, to see where behavior emerged out of where. Then we must also study that adaptations, the behaviors that you see today, are adaptations which had taken over hundreds and thousands of years. And these, if you see the continuity, there is similarity between the mammalian behavior, between the ape-man behavior and behavior of the man today, the Homo sapien. So it gives us a very nice perspective of trying to understand. Remember, I talked about the family being evolved, and I talked about the social groups being evolved, talked about the language evolving, and the attachment bond of the young with the mother. So all these adaptations make us understand why behavior is what it is today. It also gives us a perspective into the fact that we are not very different. We are not different from, let's say, the cat. Biologically, our behaviors are similar. Or the little chimpanzee, the little monkey which is running around. You look at, if you go to the zoo, I advise go and just stand there. Look at the chimpanzee and look at the primates. You'll see so much similarity on the kinds of behaviors that you and I see out on the street. So, understanding that we are one part of the animal kingdom and our behaviors are therefore similar. Let me just conclude by this particular part by saying that evolution influences genes. It does have a very strong altering component. There is a pressure of natural selection, and the genes therefore are programmed in a way that they will develop neurons and parts of the brain as they have evolved through the millions of years. So there is a programming, a genetic programming, which has been evolved, and it has evolved because it was beneficial for the Homo sapien to have this kind of programming evolved. But let me add the environment. If you remember, the natural selection pressures came from the environment. The environment influenced the genetic material, and therefore there is an constant interaction of the gene with the environment, and they both influence each other. So the same case with what we are now as human beings. So continuously the brain interacts with the environment, and continuously it is being influenced by the environment. There is a genetic programming there present, but animals on the higher final genetic scale, which means the Homo sapien, the higher we are on the phylogenetic scale, the more adaptability we have, the more capability to learn from the environment, and the more capability of modulating the programs given by the genes by the environment. So, again, I come to the conclusion that it is not just genes alone in the higher order species. It is the environment also that makes a difference. So, we come to this issue now. Environment versus genes. Nature versus nurture. If you ask a social psychologist or a sociologist, they will say environment makes a difference. Experience makes the difference. There's nothing inside which is programmed. If you ask a biologist or a psychobiologist, they'll say, no, you come in pre-programmed, and the environment is only there to precipitate what is already there, or to begin, or to trigger what is already there. Very interesting discussion. So, there are two very strong groups, schools of thought. One believes nature has given us all the programs and we cannot move away from them. And one believes, no, we, with our experiences, can change what is provided by nature. Very interesting. The battle goes on. Now, if you look at it and break it, remember, whatever behavior has to occur, behavior cannot occur in a vacuum. It has to, I am here in this particular studio. If I am here I am interacting with each component of this environment that I am in. You look at yourself wherever you're sitting, look around you, you are interacting with the components around you, the social components. Similarly, at home, similarly, at school, similarly, with friends, you are constantly modulating your behavior in relation to the environment. So that is something we must remember. Number two, you must remember behavior, natural behavior affects environment and is affected by it. So there is a dual relationship, mutual relationship. It is not one way, it is both ways. Both influence each other and both are changed by what the other influences. So nature, what nature has provided is changed. Let me think about an example while we're talking, and I'll get back to you in a minute. There is another school which believes an organism comes completely programmed, genetically determined. I mean, they use such strong words, genetically determined. And they have biological structures which determine the limits of these biological structures. Very well said. True. I cannot fly. My biological limitations are, I can fly in a plane, I can fly in an extension, I can fly in a balloon, but I don't have the wings to fly. So the biological limitations are there. And this is genetically determined. So that we understand, the capabilities and limits are given by our genes. But whatever, if you are not using your hand to write, or to use tools, or to play tennis, these muscles will become flaccid. You need the stimulation to develop these muscles and to keep them in strength and in shape and in form. So, environment has to interact with whatever biological capabilities I have. There is another group of psychobiologists who believes that even behavior is genetically determined. In fact, there is a group which is called sociobiologists, which believe that even the complex social behaviors that you and I express are genetically determined, biologically and genetically determined. So we will call them determinism school of thought, where you believe everything is predetermined. Why? The sociobiologists argue that if I give my life for my children, if I die in the process, we call it altruistic, giving your life up for others. But sociobiologists say, I'm giving up my life because these are my gene investments that I'm protecting. Therefore, I will give my life so they can live on. I have lived my life and I have passed on my genes. Very, very, very deterministic point of view, that everything is biologically done and biologically stated and biologically programmed. But let us take up via media. You and I belong to a generation where we don't want to take a stand very strong either way, because we are rational and we understand that both behavior, which may be genetically determined, does need an environment in which it can be exploited, or it can be expressed, or it can become part of that behavioral repertoire. Behavior अंदर होगा, genetically होगा, लेकिन जब तक उसको सही environment नहीं मिलेगी, वो एक्सप्लॉइट नहीं होगा या वो एक्सप्रेस नहीं होगा. मेरे पास बहुत कैपेबिलिटी है कि मैं तेज भाग सकती हूँ, ठीक है, मेरे जेनेटिकली प्रोग्राम्ड है क्योंकि मेरे forefathers बहुत भागा करते थे और they were good runners. But if I sit in a seat all day, I don't have the environment in which I can flex my muscles and run. Think about the possibilities. Now there was, I would like to say this again, a young man who's playing tennis comes from a family of tennis players. And today he is in Wimbledon. So अगर वो विंबलडन तक पहुंचा है वो इसलिए नहीं, उसके पास बायोलॉजिकल कैपेबिलिटी थी, फैमिली की जेनेटिक मटेरियल था, एंड देन एनवायरनमेंट उसको ऐसी मिली जहां वो टेनिस खेल सकता था. एंड दैट इज अ गुड एग्जांपल ऑफ हाउ वी पुट द जेनेटिक मटेरियल टू वर्क in an appropriate environment. So, you and I are rational, and we are not going to take a very strong stand on this, whether it is nature or whether it is nurture. When we're talking about nature, we're talking about what is innate. Innate means inborn. Inborn means inside, genetically and biologically programmed. When we are talking about learned means that there is a capability, but that capability is very flexible. Let me give you two examples. One example is the example of the fruit flies, extremely determined biologically behavior. They see the light and they will fly towards the light. They see the fruit, they will fly towards the fruit. Programmed to do that. Completely innate behavior. On the other hand, when you talk about the human language, that is learnt. Every child is born with equipment, the same equipment. Whether the child is born in China, or is born in Russia, or is born in France, or is born in one of the Arabian countries, all have the same capability. But the learning that takes place determines how the vocal cords are going to articulate those words. So it's a completely learned and environmentally influenced behavior. So we agree there are some behaviors which are innately determined and some behaviors which are learnt, and most of the behaviors lie in between. The question then is, if there are some behaviors which are completely determined, do genes determine behavior? Think about it. क्या genes हमारे behavior को determine करते हैं? Genes क्या हैं? क्या determine करते हैं? वो सिर्फ synthesis of proteins provide करते हैं, amino acids provide करते हैं, कि कोड देते हैं कि कौन सी genes क्या करते हैं, कोड देते हैं कि कौन सी proteins, कौन से amino acids, कौन से chemicals बनने हैं. अब इन और बनने हैं और किस वक्त रिलीज होने बॉडी में. अमेजिंग बात यह है कि ये प्रोटीन्स एंड चेन्स ऑफ अमाइनो एसिड्स, एंड आई लाइक टू से दैट लुक एट आवरसेल्व्स इन द शेप एंड द फॉर्म दैट वी आर, दे आर नथिंग बट चेन्स ऑफ अमाइनो एसिड्स. सो ये चेन ऑफ अमाइनो एसिड्स जो है ये जीन्स डिटरमिन करते हैं, और फिर ये आगे डिटरमिन करते हैं कि क्या फॉर्म, शेप, कैपेबिलिटीज होंगी. Programming of genetic genes then determine the programming of the brain and the development of the brain, which can flourish in a certain environment. The cues for development of that particular capability come from the environment. So programming genetic genes से आती है, वो डिटरमिन करते हैं कि ब्रेन में क्या प्रोग्राम्स होंगे, या क्या कैपेबिलिटीज होंगी, या क्या उसके अंदर डेवलपमेंट्स होंगी, या क्या अमाइनो एसिड्स प्रोवाइड किए जाएंगे. लेकिन उसके साथ पॉसिबिलिटी कि ये कहाँ पे फ्लरिश होगी, कैसी एनवायरनमेंट में फ्लरिश होगी. द क्यूज कम फ्रॉम द एनवायरनमेंट, एंड द क्यूज विच कम फ्रॉम द एनवायरनमेंट आर एक्सटर्नल क्यूज. फॉर एग्जाम्पल, वन एक्सटर्नल क्यू वुड बी, जैसे आपको याद है एक एक्सपेरिमेंट मैंने ह्यूबल और वीजल का दिया था कि एक्सटर्नल एनवायरनमेंट को देख उन्होंने कैट्स जो ही पैदा हुई उनकी आंखों पे वो एक गॉगल डाल दी जो बिल्कुल ब्लैक थी और एक गॉगल डाल दी जिसमें ग्रिड था. और उनकी ब्रेन की डेवलपमेंट जो थी वो उस तरह हुई कि एक आंख बिल्कुल देख नहीं सकती थी, हालांकि ठीक थी क्योंकि ब्रेन डेवलपमेंट नहीं हुई थी, और दूसरे में ग्रिड्स में नजर आता था उनको. सो एक्सटर्नल स्टिमुलेशन इज इंपॉर्टेंट इवन फॉर व्हाट इज हैपनिंग विद इन द ब्रेन. फिर सिंपल एग्जांपल, खतरनाक जानवर को देख के हम भागते हैं. क्यों, कहां से आई? हमने देखा, हमने इसको अंडरस्टैंड किया, ये खतरनाक है, जान का खतरा है, भागो. सो द एक्सटर्नल एनवायरनमेंट प्रोवाइड्स cues for the internal environment to make a judgment, and resultant behavior comes from the interaction of both. Internal cues कहाँ से आती है? एक्सटर्नल cues तो ये आ गई, जंगल से आ गई, गाड़ी को देखा सड़क पे आ रही है, भागो, सड़क क्रॉस करो, इतना डिस्टेंस चाहिए हमको भागने के लिए. इंटरनल क्यूज भी आती हैं एक्सटर्नल क्यूज के अलावा. इंटरनल क्यूज कहाँ से? आपको इस वक्त कोई इंटरनल क्यूज तो नहीं आ रही अपने आप से? भूख तो नहीं लग रही? when you feel hungry, when you feel tired, these are cues which are being sent by your internal systems, and these internal systems tell you, look, do something. So external cues, internal cues from within the organs and from within the other systems. इसके साथ ही एक बड़ी इंटरेस्टिंग आपको बात बताऊं कि इंटरनल क्यूज और भी आती हैं. अब चिड़ियों को आप देखते हैं, आजकल मौसम होगा, चिड़िया जो है वो घोंसले बना रही है. ये चिड़ियों ने घोंसले बनाना क्यों? सूरज को देख के, चांद को देख के, या मौसम को देख के, या बारिश को देख के तो नहीं बनाना शुरू किया. वेरी इंटरेस्टिंग. दे हैव दिस internal cues coming in, and their internal cues are coming from a form of chemical जिसका नाम है prostaglandins. जो ही prostaglandins जिस्म में आते हैं, these birds start looking, this is a cue, nest building की cue है, looking for nest because going to prepare their homes. ये कभी हमने सोचा नहीं, लेकिन अगली दफा अब आप जब कभी चिड़ियों को देखें कि वो तिनके उठा के जा रहे हैं, तो यू मस्ट रिमेंबर ये प्रोस्टाग्लैंडिन से क्यूज आई हैं जिसकी वजह से वो अब घोंसला बनाने जा रहे हैं. नाउ व्हाट वी सी हियर इज दैट सिंपलर बिहेवियर लाइक हंगर, थर्स्ट, बट इवन कॉम्प्लेक्स बिहेवियर लाइक नेस्ट बिल्डिंग हैज बीन फाउंड टू बी इंटरनली रिलेटेड. एंड देयर इज अ कॉम्बिनेशन, ऑफ कोर्स. कॉम्बिनेशन इस तरह से कि आपको भूख नहीं लगी है, आपने खूब सैर होके खाना खा लिया, उधर से किचन से खुशबू आ रही है या कैंटीन से खुशबू आ रही समोसे तलने की, एकदम से भूख लगने लग जाती है, समोसों की भूख. नाउ हियर इज अ वेरी इंटरेस्टिंग कॉम्बिनेशन ऑफ द इंटरनल एंड द एक्सटर्नल cues. तो कॉम्बिनेशन दोनों की है which then propagates you that you go look for samosa in the kitchen or the food that is being fried in the canteen. So external cues, internal cues, and a combination. And we believe that they work together. Internal cues act on the external, and the external cues act on the inside, inner organism, and the brain, and both of them work together as combination. Then the question arises, can experience affect your innate behavior? Innate means inborn behavior. There are some schools of thought which believe, no, you cannot. You cannot change what has been innately given. इसके लिए 2-3 एग्जांपल्स मैं आपको दूंगी. हम सब कहते हैं कि माँ जो है उसका, उससे बढ़कर प्यार कोई दे ही नहीं सकता. हम मानते हैं सब, बट जो बायोलॉजिस्ट हैं और जो साइकोबायोलॉजिस्ट हैं और जो सोशियोबायोलॉजिस्ट हैं, एनालिसिस करके वो कहते हैं इट इज नॉट, ये हॉर्मोन्स हैं, अप्रोप्रिएट लेवल ऑफ हॉर्मोन्स जिसने मदरिंग को या मटरनल बिहेवियर को अराउज किया है. वेरी इंटरेस्टिंग. सो बायोलॉजिकली डिटरमिन्ड है वो बिहेवियर, हॉर्मोन्स डिपेंडेंट है वो बिहेवियर, और हॉर्मोन्स अप्रोप्रिएट लेवल ऑफ हार्मोन, सही लेवल हार्मोन्स होंगी तो मदरिंग बिहेवियर शुरू होता है. इनफैक्ट injections in females which have experienced motherhood before, if they do not even have children, young offspring, animals may, if they're injected with the appropriate maternal hormones, they start mothering other infants. But इसके लिए पहला एक्सपीरियंस जरूरी है of having had been a mother. तो इंटरैक्शन है, यहां पर भी है. और ये इन्होंने एक्सपेरिमेंट्स किए थे ब्रिंग डव्स पे, जिसको हम घुगी कहते हैं. अगर पहले घुगी ने बच्चे अंडे दिए और उसमें से बच्चे निकले और वो मदरिंग की, तो उसके बाद जब बच्चे ना भी हों, अंडे ना भी हों, उनको टीका लगाएं तो वो मदरिंग बिहेवियर में इंडल्ज करते हैं. सो बिहेवियर इज इनेटली डिटरमिन्ड. वी ऑल नो दैट नाउ. और डू वी नो? This is a very interesting controversy and still going on, and I will give you a very thorough input later on. You think about it. आप अपने आप को देखिए, अपने आप को एनालाइज कीजिए और एक लिस्ट बनाइए of what behaviors you think and you see are innately determined and what behaviors you think you have learned from the environment. ये आपको एक इंसाइट मिलेगी. एंड व्हाट बिहेवियर्स आर अ कॉम्बिनेशन. सो नेक्स्ट टाइम यू गो रनिंग टू द कैंटीन, think whether it is internal cues, whether it is external cues, or whether it is a combination of both. We are going to continue this discussion in the next class. But do your readings and do go and watch, if you can have the time to do so, National Geographic and Discovery Channel में बड़े interesting behavioral, animal behavior, human behavior के programs आते हैं.